The fluorescent lights in the private ICU wing hummed with a frequency that always made Eleanor's teeth ache, but tonight the sound felt sharper, more insistent, as if warning her away from the room at the end of the corridor. She adjusted her stethoscope around her neck and checked the patient chart one more time before entering, her fingers trembling slightly against the metal clipboard. James Thornhill. The name alone carried weight in this city, whispered in back rooms and dark alleys, associated with power and violence and a kind of order that existed outside the law. She had heard the other nurses talking during shift change, their voices dropping low when they mentioned who lay behind the reinforced door, who required two security guards stationed in the hallway at all times. A shooting, they said, nearly fatal. 3 bullets, one missing his heart by centimeters. She pushed through the door, and the quiet of the room enveloped her like water, thick and suffocating. He lay motionless in the bed, tubes and wires connecting him to machines that beeped steadily, monitoring a life suspended between consciousness and oblivion. Eleanor approached slowly, her soft-soled shoes silent against the linoleum, and for a long moment she simply stood there looking at him. He was not what she expected. Somehow she had imagined someone coarser, marked by cruelty, but the man before her had a face that might have been carved from marble, all sharp angles and strong lines, dark hair slightly too long, jaw shadowed with several days of stubble. Even unconscious, he looked dangerous, powerful. She reached for his wrist to check his pulse, her fingers gentle against his warm skin, and felt the steady throb of his heartbeat against her fingertips. Strong, vital. She recorded his vitals on the chart, and then began her assessment, checking the IV lines, adjusting the flow of medication, examining the bandages that wrapped his torso. She had always talked to her coma patients, a habit born from the belief that some part of them might still be listening, might find comfort in a human voice cutting through the darkness. The words came without planning. "I know who you are." She said it quietly, almost a whisper, her eyes fixed on the monitor instead of his face. "I have heard what people say about you, what you do, what you control." Her throat tightened and she forced herself to continue, needing to speak the truth aloud even if he could not hear it. "I am afraid of you. Terrified, actually. I keep thinking about what will happen when you wake up, if you will be angry about being here, vulnerable, if you will hurt the people who failed to protect you, if somehow your world will reach out and touch mine." She did not know that behind his closed eyelids, James Thornhill was screaming. His mind had clawed its way back to consciousness 3 hours ago, his thoughts sharp and clear and frantic, but his body refused to respond, trapped in chemical paralysis, a prisoner in his own flesh. He could hear everything. The machines, her footsteps, her voice. Every word she spoke carved itself into his awareness with perfect clarity. He heard her fear and felt something unexpected stir in the darkness where he drifted. She was afraid of him. She should be. But her hands on his skin were gentle. Eleanor settled into the chair beside his bed and opened the chart again, documenting the assessment with careful precision, her handwriting small and neat, despite the tremor that had not quite left her fingers. She glanced at the clock on the wall. 2:17 in the morning. 6 more hours until shift change. The hospital at night always felt like a separate world, removed from daylight reality, and tonight that feeling pressed down on her with unusual weight. She reached forward to adjust his blanket, a purely unnecessary gesture born from the need to do something with her hands, and found herself speaking again, softer this time, almost confessional. "My brother Samuel owes money to dangerous people. I do not know all the details because he will not tell me everything, but I know it is bad. Gambling debts, he says, like that makes it simpler, less terrifying." She laughed, a bitter sound that caught in her throat. "I have been working double shifts for 8 months trying to help him pay it down, but it never seems to be enough. The interest keeps growing. The men who come to collect keep getting more insistent, more threatening." She rubbed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her bones. I am so tired. Tired of being afraid every time my phone rings. Tired of jumping at shadows. Tired of living in a world where people like you make the rules that people like Samuel break and people like me pay for. Inside his paralyzed body, James listened to every word with an attention that bordered on obsession, his consciousness latching onto her voice like a lifeline in the drowning dark. Samuel Sinclair. He catalogued the name, turned it over in his mind, searching his memory for any connection. Gambling debts. That narrowed it down. Several operations ran games in his territory, some sanctioned, some not. If her brother owed money to one of his people, James could end it with a word, wipe the debt away like it never existed. The thought surprised him with its immediacy. He did not know this woman beyond her gentle hands and frightened voice. Yet something in her honesty, her raw vulnerability spoken into what she believed was silence, had hooked itself into him. His mind drifted back to the shooting, fragments of memory sharp as broken glass. The warehouse on the South Docks. The meeting that was supposed to finalize the new distribution routes. Robert Crawford standing too far to his right, positioned wrong, his hand moving toward his jacket a half-second before the shots exploded from the shadows. 3 bullets. James had seen Crawford's face in that split second of betrayal, had understood everything in a single instant of terrible clarity, his second in command, his friend for 12 years, bought or turned or simply ambitious. It did not matter why. Only that he had tried and failed. James was still alive, and that meant Crawford was a dead man. He just did not know it yet. But even as rage simmered in his trapped consciousness, even as he mentally catalogued every person who would pay for this betrayal, he found his attention pulled back to Eleanor's voice, to the way she sighed and stood to check his IV line, to the warmth of her hand when she pressed her fingers to his wrist again, counting his heartbeats. "You probably cannot hear me anyway," she whispered. "Maybe that is why it feels safe to say these things out loud. Because you are not really here. Because when you wake up, you will not remember the scared nurse who talked to your unconscious body about her pathetic problems." She moved away to update the monitors, and James wished with a desperation that shocked him that he could open his eyes, move his hand, tell her he heard everything. Eleanor pushed through the door to his room at exactly 10 p.m., the beginning of her second shift caring for James Thornhill, and immediately her trained eye caught the irregularities in his vitals displayed on the monitors. Heart rate variability had increased, subtle fluctuations that had not been present 24 hours ago, and his blood pressure showed periodic elevations that did not align with the sedation protocol. She moved closer to the bed, her pulse quickening with a mixture of clinical concern and something else, something that felt uncomfortably like fear. She leaned over him, reaching for the penlight clipped to her scrub pocket, and gently lifted one eyelid to check his pupillary response. The light swept across his eye, and the pupil contracted sharply, more reactive than it should be given his medication levels. She moved to the other eye, her face now inches from his, close enough that she could see the individual dark lashes against his skin, the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow. Close enough that James, trapped in his paralysis but burning with awareness, could smell her, something floral and clean, soap or shampoo, cutting through the antiseptic hospital air. She straightened, frowning at the chart, and he wanted to scream at her to run. To understand that if he was showing signs of waking, then others would notice too, that Crawford would hear about it, that anyone still in the room when he fully surfaced might not be safe. She set the chart down and did something unexpected. She pulled the chair closer to his bed and sat, her elbows resting on her knees, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "A man came by earlier today, during the shift change. Tall, expensive suit, the kind that costs more than I make in 3 months. He was asking questions about you, about your condition, about when the doctors expect you to regain consciousness." Her fingers twisted together, knuckles white. The charge nurse started to answer him, but I interrupted. told him that coma patients are unpredictable, that you are showing no signs of awareness, that it could be weeks or even months. She paused, and James felt something crack open in his chest, some wall he had spent years building. I do not know why I did that. You are exactly the kind of man I should stay away from, the kind who brings violence and chaos everywhere he goes. But he looked wrong. His questions felt wrong. Like he was not hoping you would wake up. Like he was checking to make sure you would not. She reached out, hesitated, then let her hand rest lightly on the bed rail near his arm, not quite touching but close. I hope you do not wake up soon. Not because I want you to suffer, but because I think you are safer asleep than conscious, at least for now. At least until whoever shot you thinks you are no longer a threat. Her words settled over James like a revelation, reordering everything he thought he understood about the situation. She was protecting him. This woman who feared him, who owed him nothing, who had every reason to stay silent and uninvolved, had looked at a dangerous stranger asking questions and lied to keep James safe. She had put herself between him and whatever threat that man represented, had made herself visible to people who now knew she was an obstacle. Crawford would hear about this, would know that someone was deflecting inquiries, would take steps to remove that obstacle. James tried with every ounce of will he possessed to move his hand, to signal somehow that he heard her, that he understood, that she needed to run. Eleanor was halfway through documenting medication administration when the door to the ICU swung open with enough force to make her jump, and Samuel stumbled through, his face pale and slicked with sweat, his eyes wild with the kind of panic she had seen too many times in the past year. "Sam, what are you doing here?" she hissed, moving quickly to intercept him before he could get further into the unit, her hands gripping his arms, feeling him tremble beneath her touch. "They found me, Ellie. They found me at the apartment, 3 of them, asking questions about you, about where you work, about how much money you make, and I think they know. I think they know I have been lying about having the cash." His words tumbled out in a frantic rush, and Eleanor felt ice slide down her spine, her gaze darting to the nurse's station where Karen sat typing notes, oblivious. "You need to leave," she said, keeping her voice low and steady despite the fear clawing up her throat. "I am working. You cannot be here like this." He grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging in with desperate strength. "I need $5,000, Ellie. Just 5,000, and they will give me 2 more weeks. I can figure something out in 2 weeks. I swear, I just need you to help me this one last time." She pulled free, stepping back, shaking her head even as her heart broke watching him unravel. "I do not have it, Sam. I have told you a dozen times I do not have that kind of money. I am barely covering rent and your last payment. There is nothing left." His face crumpled, and for a moment he looked like the little brother she had raised after their mother died, small and scared and looking to her to fix everything. "Please," he whispered. But she forced herself to stay firm, to not give in the way she always had before. "No, Samuel, no more. You need to figure this out yourself. I cannot keep doing this." He stared at her like she had struck him, then turned and left without another word, the door swinging shut behind him with a soft click that sounded like finality. Eleanor stood frozen in the hallway for 10 seconds, 20, trying to pull herself back together, trying to shove the terror and guilt back down into the box where she kept all the things she could not afford to feel during a shift. She returned to James's room on autopilot, closing the door behind her and leaning against it, her chest tight and her eyes burning. "I am sorry," she said to the silent man in the bed, her voice breaking. "I am sorry for bringing my mess into your space, for talking about my problems like you are my therapist instead of my patient, for being so pathetic that I fall apart in front of someone who cannot even tell me to shut up and pull myself together." She moved to his bedside and did something she had never done with any patient. She reached out and wrapped her hand around his, feeling the warmth of his skin, the solidness of bone and tendon beneath. "I just need 1 minute," she whispered, squeezing her eyes shut against the tears. Just 1 minute to pretend I am not alone in this. James felt her touch like electricity, felt her hand trembling against his, and he gathered every fragment of will and consciousness and pushed, demanding his body obey. His finger twitched against her palm. Eleanor jerked her hand back like she had been burned, staring at his fingers where they lay motionless again against the white sheet, her heart slamming against her ribs as she tried to process what she had just felt, the tiny movement that should not have been possible. She fumbled for the call button, pressing it 3 times in rapid succession, her training kicking in even as her mind reeled, and within 90 seconds Dr. Mehta was in the room asking what happened, his expression shifting from mild annoyance to sharp focus when she explained the involuntary response. They ran tests for the next hour, neurological assessments and reflex checks, adjusting monitor settings and reviewing medication dosages. And Dr. Mehta made the decision to begin reducing the sedation incrementally, explaining to Eleanor that the movement suggested James's brain was fighting the induced coma, that keeping him under might cause more harm than allowing natural emergence. She nodded, taking notes, her professional mask firmly in place, even though inside she felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing everything was about to change. Over the next 6 hours, she watched his vitals shift and stabilize as the medication levels dropped, watched the almost imperceptible increase in muscle tone, the way his breathing pattern altered slightly, becoming less mechanical and more natural. She knew he was aware now, truly aware, probably listening to every sound in the room, and the thought made her skin prickle with a combination of fear and something she could not name. She kept her voice neutral when she spoke, explaining each procedure as she performed it, checking IV lines and adjusting his position to prevent pressure sores, acting like he was still unconscious because she did not know what else to do. At 11 p.m., the door opened, and Eleanor looked up to see a man in a dark suit, different from the one 2 days ago, but cut from the same cloth, expensive and cold, his eyes scanning the room with predatory assessment before landing on her. "I am looking for information about Mr. Thornhill," he said, his voice smooth and empty of warmth. "His family is very concerned about his progress." Eleanor stood, placing herself between the man and the bed, her pulse racing, but her expression calm. "Are you listed as his emergency contact?" she asked, knowing he was not, knowing the only name on James's intake paperwork was his lawyer. The man smiled, a thin movement of lips that did not reach his eyes. "Just a concerned associate. I was hoping you could tell me if there have been any changes in his condition, any signs of waking." She met his gaze steadily, feeling James's presence behind her like heat, wondering if he could hear this, if he understood what she was about to do. "No changes," she said clearly. "He remains unresponsive, no neurological activity beyond basic brainstem function. The doctors are not optimistic about significant recovery in the near term." The lie tasted like metal on her tongue. The man studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, then nodded once and left without another word. Eleanor waited until his footsteps faded down the corridor, then crossed to the door and turned the lock with shaking hands, pressing her forehead against the cool wood and trying to remember how to breathe. Eleanor stood with her back against the door for several minutes, trying to steady herself before she turned and walked back to the bedside, checking the monitors out of habit, even though her hands were still unsteady. And when she finally looked at James's face, she found his eyes open and watching her with an intensity that stopped her breath in her chest. She gasped, stumbling back a step, her training screaming at her to call for the doctor, but her body frozen in place as his gaze tracked her movement, with perfect clarity. No confusion or disorientation, just absolute focused awareness that told her he was fully conscious and had been for longer than the past few seconds. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was rough from days of disuse, scraping against the silence like gravel, but it was steady and deliberate, and it was her name in his mouth, and she had never told him her name. She pressed her hand to her throat, feeling her pulse hammer against her palm. "How do you know my name?" she whispered, but even as she asked, she understood. the terrible dawning realization washing over her like ice water. "You heard me," she said, not a question but a statement of fact that made her want to sink through the floor. "You heard everything I said." James shifted slightly against the pillows, a small movement that made him wince, but his eyes never left her face. "Every word," he confirmed. "From the first night when you told me you were afraid of me, to 20 minutes ago when you lied to protect me from a man who wants me dead." She could not breathe properly, could not think past the humiliation and terror of knowing he had been a silent witness to all her confessions, her fears, her desperate admission about Samuel, everything she had poured out believing he could not hear. "I should call Dr. Mehta," she managed, moving toward the phone, needing to do something that made sense in a world that had just tilted sideways. "Do not," James said, and it was not loud but it carried absolute command, the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She stopped, her hand hovering over the receiver. "Please," he added, and the word sounded less familiar in his mouth, like he did not use it often. "I need to talk to you first, before anyone knows I am awake, before the wrong people find out." Eleanor turned to face him, wrapping her arms around herself. "I do not understand what you want from me." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable except for something in his eyes that might have been respect or calculation, or something else entirely. "You protected me, Eleanor. You put yourself at risk when that man came asking questions. You lied for me when you had every reason to tell the truth and wash your hands of whatever danger I represent. Why?" She shook her head, searching for an answer that made sense. "You were my patient. You were helpless. I could not just let someone hurt you." His mouth curved slightly, not quite a smile. "I have not been helpless in 20 years, but I was vulnerable, and you stood between me and a threat without hesitation. Do you understand what that means?" She did not, could not process the weight he was putting on her actions. James pulled himself higher against the pillows despite the obvious pain it caused. "The man who was here tonight works for someone in my organization, someone who tried to kill me and will try again as soon as he knows I am conscious, and now you are in danger too because you have been seen protecting me." Eleanor called Dr. Mehta at dawn, her voice professionally calm as she reported that James had regained consciousness with full neurological function, and within 30 minutes, the private wing transformed into controlled chaos, with doctors running assessments and nurses checking vitals, while James answered questions with minimal words, his gaze tracking Eleanor as she tried to maintain distance by staying near the door. Dr. Mehta declared it a remarkable recovery and adjusted the treatment plan, and Eleanor thought she could return to her normal rotation, put space between herself and the man who had heard every vulnerable word she had spoken. But at 9 a.m., the nursing supervisor called her into the office with an expression that was equal parts confused and intimidated. "Mr. Thornhill has requested you be assigned as his exclusive private nurse for the duration of his stay," the supervisor said, "and hospital administration has approved it with a substantial compensation adjustment. You will be on 12-hour shifts at triple your current rate." Eleanor felt her stomach drop, understanding immediately that James had made this happen, that he had reached out from his hospital bed and rearranged her life with whatever power and money he commanded. "I need to stay on my regular rotation," Eleanor protested. "I have other patients who depend on me." The supervisor shook her head, her discomfort obvious. "This came from the top, Eleanor, the board level. I do not have authority to override it. You start tonight at 7 p.m. Eleanor returned to the ICU wing, feeling like the walls were closing in, and stopped short when she saw 4 men in dark suits stationed in the corridor outside James's room, their presence radiating controlled violence that made other nurses give the area a wide berth. She forced herself to walk past them, feeling their eyes assess and catalog her, and entered James's room to find him sitting up against the pillows, looking stronger than he had any right to after being shot 3 times only days ago. "You cannot do this," she said without preamble, keeping her voice low. "You cannot just rearrange my job because you decided I need to be here." James regarded her with those unsettling eyes that seemed to see straight through every defense she tried to construct. "I can, and I did," he said simply. "You are in danger now, Eleanor. Anyone who saw you protect me is a potential threat, and I need you where I can keep you safe." She crossed her arms, anger flaring hot in her chest. "I do not need your protection. I need you to leave me alone so I can go back to my normal life." "Where is your second in command?" James asked, changing directions so abruptly she blinked. "Robert Crawford. He should have been the first person here when I woke up, but I notice he is not among the men outside." The deliberate shift in topic felt like a trap, but Eleanor answered anyway. "I have not seen him, just these others who arrived an hour ago." James nodded slowly, his expression hardening into something that made her remember exactly who he was beneath the hospital gown and IV lines. "Crawford was my right hand for 8 years. He knew every detail of my schedule and security. He is the only person who could have arranged the ambush that put me here." Eleanor felt ice slide down her spine as she understood what he was telling her. "And the man who came asking about you works for Crawford," James confirmed. "Which means Crawford knows you lied to protect me, knows you are a vulnerability he can exploit." She wanted to argue, to insist she could handle herself, but the memory of that man's cold eyes made the words die in her throat. Eleanor's shift that night felt like walking through a minefield where every word could detonate, and she kept her conversations with James strictly clinical while checking his vitals and adjusting his medications. But he watched her with that unnerving focus that made her feel transparent. And finally he asked about Samuel in a tone that was casual but deliberate, asking how much her brother owed and to whom. She tried to deflect, insisting it was not his concern, but James persisted with the patience of someone accustomed to getting answers, and eventually she found herself admitting that Samuel owed $40,000 to men she had never met, men who called at all hours with threats that grew more specific each time. James was quiet for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the monitors. "The men threatening your brother," he said finally, "they work for Crawford. They have been operating a loan sharking operation I shut down 8 months ago, which means Crawford brought it back without my knowledge or approval." Eleanor felt her chest tighten as she processed what he was telling her. Understanding that her brother's debt was tangled up in the same betrayal that had nearly killed James. "I can handle this," James said. "I can make Samuel's debt disappear and ensure those men never contact either of you again." She shook her head immediately, instinct screaming at her not to accept, not to owe this man anything more than she already did simply by being in his orbit. "I cannot let you do that," she said. "I do not want to owe you." He tilted his head slightly, studying her with something that might have been admiration. "You already owe me nothing, Eleanor. You saved my life when you lied to Crawford's man, but your pride will not protect your brother from what is coming." She wanted to argue, but the weight of exhaustion and fear pressed down on her, and she finished her shift in tense silence, avoiding James's gaze as she documented his vitals and prepared for the shift change. She drove home at 7 a.m. with her mind spinning, and when she turned onto her street she saw the police cars first, then the ambulance, then the blood on the sidewalk outside her apartment building. Her body moved without conscious thought, parking badly and running toward the scene, and a police officer caught her arm, but she was already screaming Samuel's name. "Ma'am, you need to stay back," the officer said, but she saw the paramedics lifting a gurney, and she knew with terrible certainty. "That is my brother," she choked out, and the officer's expression shifted to something like pity. "He was assaulted approximately 2 hours ago, multiple stab wounds. He is alive but critical." Eleanor's vision tunneled, sound becoming distant and distorted, and she gave her information to the police in a voice that did not sound like her own. Then followed the ambulance to the hospital where Samuel was rushed into surgery. She sat in the waiting room with blood on her shoes, her phone clutched in her hand, and she knew with absolute clarity that her refusal to accept James's help had done this, that her pride had nearly killed her brother, and the knowledge tasted like ash in her mouth. Eleanor sat in the surgical waiting room for 4 hours, with fluorescent lights burning her eyes, and the smell of antiseptic making her nauseous. And when the surgeon finally emerged to tell her that Samuel would survive, but had lost significant blood and would need weeks of recovery, she felt something inside her crack open, all the pride and stubbornness that had kept her from accepting help shattering under the weight of what her refusal had cost. She thanked the surgeon and went to see Samuel in recovery, his face pale against the pillows and tubes running from his arms. And she touched his hand gently before turning and walking out of the hospital with a clarity of purpose that felt like falling and flying simultaneously. She drove across the city as dawn broke, still wearing the same scrubs she had worn for her shift the night before, blood still on her shoes, and when she reached the hospital where James was a patient, the men in suits recognized her and stepped aside without question as she walked past them and pushed open his door. James was awake, sitting up in bed with a tablet in his hands that he set aside immediately when he saw her face, and she watched his expression shift from surprise to understanding to something darker and more intent. "Eleanor," he said. But she shook her head and crossed the room until she was standing beside his bed, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. "You were right," she said, her voice steady despite the tears sliding down her cheeks. "My pride almost killed him, and I cannot do this alone anymore, so I am here to accept your help in exchange for whatever you want from me." James studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving over her face with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare, and then he reached up and took her hand, his grip warm and surprisingly gentle. "Sit down before you fall down," he said, and she sank into the chair beside his bed, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was, how many hours she had been awake, how much fear she had been carrying. "Your brother?" James asked. "He will survive," Eleanor said. "They said he was stabbed 7 times, but none of the wounds hit anything vital. He was lucky." James made a sound that was not quite agreement, his jaw tightening. Luck had nothing to do with it. They wanted to send a message, not kill him. This was Crawford reminding me that he can reach anyone I care about. The casual acknowledgement that James cared about her, about Samuel by extension, made her chest constrict. "What do I owe you?" she asked, needing to know the price of accepting his protection. James was quiet for a moment, his thumb moving absently over her knuckles where he still held her hand. "The debt is erased," he said finally. "Your brother will be protected, and you owe me nothing except honesty." She stared at him, confusion warring with disbelief. "That does not make sense. You do not do anything without a price." "Everyone says that about you." He smiled slightly, the expression transforming his face into something almost gentle. "Then everyone does not know me as well as they think," he said. "You saved my life, Eleanor. You put yourself at risk when you had every reason to walk away and let Crawford's man finish what the shooting started. So tell me why you did it." She swallowed hard, the question cutting through every defense she had left. "I could not," she whispered. "I could not let someone hurt you when you could not fight back. Even knowing who you are and what you have done, it felt wrong to let you be defenseless." His eyes searched hers, something shifting in their depths. "That is the truth I wanted," he said softly. "Everything else is already handled." James was discharged 3 days later with instructions for wound care and physical therapy that his own doctor would oversee, and Eleanor stood in his hospital room as he signed the discharge papers with an efficiency that spoke of a man accustomed to controlling every aspect of his world. And when he looked up at her, his expression was calm but determined. "I want you to come to my estate as my private nurse for the remainder of my recovery," he said. "I will pay you 3 times your current salary, and you will have your own quarters, full access to medical supplies, and Samuel will be moved to a private facility with 24-hour security that I will cover entirely." Eleanor's first instinct was to refuse, to maintain some boundary between his world and hers. But the weight of Samuel's medical bills and the knowledge that her brother needed protection she could not provide made the choice for her, and she found herself nodding even as her stomach twisted with apprehension. I will need to give notice at the hospital, she said. Already handled, James replied. I spoke with the administration this morning and they have accepted your resignation with a generous severance package. Your replacement starts tonight. The casual demonstration of his reach should have frightened her, but instead she felt a strange relief at having decisions made, at not having to carry everything alone anymore. She rode with him in a black SUV with tinted windows, two additional vehicles forming a convoy that moved through the city with aggressive efficiency, and she watched the neighborhoods change from the modest streets she knew to tree-lined avenues where homes became estates hidden behind iron gates and manicured hedges. James's property announced itself with stone pillars and a gate that opened silently as they approached, revealing a driveway that curved through grounds so expansive she could not see the edges. And then the house itself came into view, a sprawling mansion of pale stone and tall windows that caught the afternoon light like a fortress disguised as elegance. She had known he was wealthy, but seeing the reality of his power made concrete and marble and glass took her breath away, and she felt suddenly small and out of place in her jeans and practical jacket. The SUV stopped at the front entrance where men in dark suits stood watch, their eyes assessing her with the cold calculation of people paid to identify threats, and James touched her elbow lightly as they walked inside, a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. The interior was all high ceilings and understated luxury, hardwood floors gleaming under crystal chandeliers, artwork that looked museum quality on walls painted in shades of cream and gray. And Eleanor followed James through rooms that seemed designed to intimidate, to remind visitors of the vast distance between his world and theirs. A woman in her 50s with steel gray hair and a crisp black dress appeared, introducing herself as Mrs. Chen, the head of household staff, and she led Eleanor upstairs to a suite of rooms that were larger than Eleanor's entire apartment, with a bedroom, sitting area, and private bathroom decorated in soft blues and whites. Your medical supplies are in the adjoining room, Mrs. Chen said. Mr. Thornhill's suite is at the end of the hall. He has requested you check on him every 4 hours initially and adjust as his condition improves. Eleanor nodded, trying to absorb the strangeness of this new reality, and after Mrs. Chen left, she stood at the window looking out over the grounds and wondering how she had gone from a hospital nurse to a woman living in a mansion under the protection of a man whose world operated by rules she did not understand. Eleanor fell into a routine over the following week, checking on James every 4 hours as instructed, monitoring his vitals, and changing his dressings with the professional efficiency she had cultivated through years of nursing. But on the 8th night she arrived at his suite at 2 a.m. to find him sitting on the edge of his bed, with his face drained of color, and his hand pressed against his side where the wound was, and she knew immediately that he was in serious pain, though he tried to hide it when he saw her. You should have called me, she said, crossing the room quickly and kneeling in front of him to pull his hand away and examine the bandages, relieved to find no fresh bleeding, but concerned by the tension radiating through his entire body. I have handled worse, he said through gritted teeth. But she shook her head and went to prepare a dose of the pain medication his doctor had prescribed. Medication he had been refusing because he said it made him foggy and he needed to stay alert. You cannot heal if you will not let yourself rest, she told him as she administered the injection, her voice firm with the authority of someone who had spent years convincing stubborn patients to accept care. He watched her with those dark eyes that seemed to see too much, and as the medication began to work and his shoulders loosened, she found herself sitting beside him on the bed, instead of maintaining her usual distance. My brother died in a hospital, James said suddenly, his voice quiet in the dim room, lit only by a single lamp. He was 19 and I was 22, and someone put 3 bullets in him over a debt that was not even his. It was our father's. But my father was untouchable, so they took Nicholas instead. Eleanor felt her breath catch at the rawness in his words, at the grief he carried like a weight that had never lightened. I am sorry, she whispered. He looked at her and something in his expression shifted, became less guarded. I sat beside his bed for 6 hours while he bled internally and the doctors tried everything, and I made promises to him about revenge and justice. But what he actually asked me for was to make sure it meant something, that I would not just perpetuate the same violence forever. She understood then that everything James had built was both empire and monument, power and prison, a way of controlling a world that had taken someone he loved. My mother died when I was 16, Eleanor said, surprising herself with the offering of her own wound. She worked 3 jobs trying to keep us fed after my father left, and one day her heart just stopped. The doctor said it was exhaustion and stress, that her body had nothing left to give. James reached out and took her hand, his grip warm and solid, and she realized this was the first time he had initiated touch since that moment in the hospital when she had come to him desperate and breaking. "We are both carrying ghosts," he said softly. She nodded, feeling tears prick her eyes at the simple truth of it, at the recognition that they were both people shaped by loss, trying to survive in a world that took without mercy. "Yes," she whispered, and in that moment, she saw past the dangerous exterior to the man beneath, someone who carried burdens and loneliness just as she did, and the fear she had felt of him transformed into something else entirely, something that felt dangerously like understanding, like connection, like the beginning of trust built on shared wounds and honest confessions in the middle of the night. The attack came on the 12th night of her stay, when Eleanor was in the library on the first floor, looking for something to read. Because sleep had become elusive in this house, where danger felt like a living presence. And she heard the first gunshot crack through the silence, followed by shouting, and the sound of glass shattering somewhere toward the east wing. Her body froze for a single heartbeat before training took over, and she ran toward the stairs, toward James's suite. Because wounded and recovering, he would be vulnerable if Crawford had finally made his move. She reached the second-floor hallway to find 2 of James's men already positioned outside his door, weapons drawn, and one of them grabbed her arm and pulled her back just as another volley of gunfire erupted from below. "Stay here," he ordered. But she twisted free and pushed into James's suite to find it empty, his bed still made, and panic flooded her veins cold and sharp. "Where is he?" she demanded of the guard who had followed her inside. "Downstairs in the safe room," he said, but his eyes shifted, and she knew it was a lie, knew James would never hide while his home was under attack. She heard footsteps running in the hallway, and then James appeared in the doorway, dressed in black with a gun in his hand, and his face set in an expression of cold fury that reminded her exactly who he was, what he was capable of when pushed. "You should be in the safe room," he said to her. But before she could respond, one of Crawford's men burst through the door at the end of the hall, and James moved with brutal efficiency despite his healing wound. 2 shots fired with deadly precision that dropped the threat before Eleanor could process what was happening. He crossed to her in 3 strides and gripped her shoulders. "Go to my study, lock the door, do not open it for anyone except me or Marcus, do you understand?" She nodded, her ears ringing from the gunfire, and he pushed her toward the back staircase that led to the west wing, where his private study was located. She ran, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the lock once she was inside the dark wood-paneled room that smelled of leather and expensive whiskey, and she crouched behind his massive desk, listening to the sounds of violence echoing through the house, gunfire and shouting, and the crash of something heavy breaking. Minutes stretched into an eternity, and she found herself praying to a god she had stopped believing in years ago, bargaining with the universe to keep James alive, to let him walk through that door. When the lock finally clicked and the door opened, she nearly screamed until she saw it was him, alive and breathing, though there was blood on his shirt that she could not tell was his or someone else's. "It is over," he said, his voice rough. "Crawford's men are dead or captured," and he came to her where she stood on trembling legs and reached for her face with hands that were steady despite everything. She should have been terrified of him, of the violence he had just enacted, but instead she felt safe, protected, and when he lowered his mouth to hers, she did not pull away, but surrendered to the kiss that was desperate and inevitable. both of them alive and together, and finally acknowledging what had been building since the night she first spoke her fears while he lay silent and listening. They stayed in his study for a long time after that kiss, Eleanor sitting in the leather chair while James leaned against his desk in front of her, close enough that she could see the exhaustion in his face, and the blood drying on his shirt collar, and the silence between them felt heavy with everything that had just happened, with the violence and fear and the realization that they had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. "I need to tell you something," Eleanor said finally, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "When I first saw you in that hospital bed, I was terrified. Not just because I knew who you were, but because I could feel that you were different from other patients, that you would change everything if you woke up. And I was right." James watched her with an intensity that made her feel exposed, but she continued because honesty was the only currency that mattered now. "I do not see you as the monster I feared anymore. I see a man who has done terrible things for reasons I am beginning to understand. A man who protected me when he had no obligation to, who listened to my confessions in the dark and remembered every word." She stood, needing to be closer to him, needing him to see the truth in her eyes. "I trust you, James. Against all logic and self-preservation, I trust you. And I do not know what that makes me, but I know it is the truth." He reached for her hand and pulled her closer, his other hand coming up to cup her face with a gentleness that contradicted everything she had witnessed him do tonight. "Your voice," he said quietly, "is what kept me fighting to wake up. I was trapped in that bed hearing everything, feeling nothing, and I thought I would go insane until I heard you talking to me like I was a person instead of a problem to be managed. You were afraid of me, but you protected me anyway. You stood between me and danger when you had every reason to walk away." His thumb traced her cheekbone, and she leaned into the touch, her eyes closing briefly. "I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you, Eleanor. I have protected people because it served my interests, because loyalty demands it. But with you, it is different. It is a need that terrifies me, because it makes me vulnerable in ways I swore I would never be again after Nicholas died." She opened her eyes and saw the raw honesty in his expression, the admission of weakness from a man who had built an empire on strength. "This is impossible," she whispered. "You know that. The danger will never end. There will always be someone like Crawford trying to take what you have, trying to hurt the people close to you. I will always be a target at your side." He nodded slowly. "I know, and I will not lie to you about what this life means, but I am asking you to choose it anyway, to choose me with full knowledge of the cost." Eleanor felt her heart racing as she stood at the precipice of a decision that would define everything that came after. "Crawford is still out there," she said. "This is not over." "No," James agreed, his voice hardening. "It is not, and I will end him. But I need to know where you stand, if you are with me, or if I should arrange protection and distance." She looked at him, at this dangerous man who had somehow become her safety, and made her choice. "I am with you," she said clearly. "I am choosing this, choosing you, and whatever comes next, we face it together." He kissed her again, slower this time, sealing the promise they had just made to each other. James spent the next 3 days planning Crawford's end with a precision that Eleanor found both terrifying and mesmerizing as she watched him transform from the man who had kissed her with desperate tenderness into the calculating leader who commanded absolute loyalty from dangerous men. And when he told her on the fourth morning that it was time to finish this, she saw the expectation in his eyes that she would stay behind at the estate, where Marcus and 6 armed guards would ensure her safety. She listened to his instructions, the careful logic of why she needed to remain protected. And then she said no, with a clarity that made him go very still. "I understand you want me safe," she continued, meeting his gaze without flinching. "But hiding here while you walk into danger is not safety. It is just a different kind of fear. And I told you I was choosing this life, choosing you, which means I stand with you, not behind you." James looked at her for a long moment, and she saw the war in his expression between his need to protect her and his recognition that she was right, that partnership meant presence, not absence. "You stay close to me," he said finally. "You do exactly what I tell you when I tell you, and if I say run, you run without question." She agreed because she understood the difference between bravery and stupidity, and 2 hours later she was in the back of an armored car, heading toward the warehouse district, where Crawford had been tracked to a stronghold he believed was secure. James sat beside her, his hand resting on her knee, and she could feel the coiled tension in his body, the predator preparing to strike. They arrived as dawn was breaking, pale light filtering through the industrial buildings, and she watched as James's men moved with military efficiency to surround the warehouse, cutting off exits and communications. James turned to her before he opened the car door. "Stay with Marcus," he said, nodding toward his most trusted guard. "You will be able to see everything, but you will be protected." Then he was gone, moving toward the warehouse entrance with 4 men flanking him, and Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs as she stood beside Marcus watching the man she loved walk into violence. The confrontation was brutal and swift. She heard shouting, then gunfire, and forced herself not to look away when Crawford was dragged out into the open space between buildings, bloodied and defeated. James stood over him, his gun steady, and spoke words Eleanor could not hear from her position, but she saw Crawford's face drain of remaining color. The single shot that followed was execution, not combat, and she felt the finality of it reverberate through her chest. James turned and found her in the crowd of his men, his eyes searching her face for judgment or fear, and she held his gaze steadily, refusing to flinch from what he was, what he had to be to survive in this world. When he reached her, he said nothing, just pulled her against him, and she felt the tremor in his hands that no one else would ever be permitted to see. His men watched the exchange with new understanding, their boss's fierce nurse who had just witnessed his darkest work and had not turned away. And Eleanor knew in that moment that she had been claimed publicly, marked as his in a way that offered both protection and danger in equal measure. 6 weeks had passed since Crawford's execution, and Eleanor stood in the library of the estate watching morning light filter through tall windows across leather spines and polished wood, reflecting on how completely her life had transformed from the night she first walked into that ICU room, terrified of the man lying motionless in the bed. And now that same man was hers, in ways she still struggled to fully comprehend. His world had become her world, his dangers her dangers, his loyalty her shield. Samuel had recovered in a private facility James had arranged, the medical bills paid without discussion, and 2 weeks ago her brother had been relocated to the coast where he managed one of James's legitimate shipping operations, a job that offered both distance from his past mistakes and a chance to rebuild under the protection of a name that carried weight. Eleanor spoke to him weakly and heard the gratitude and bewilderment in his voice that his sister's dangerous choice had somehow saved them both. She had resigned from the hospital officially last week, her supervisor accepting the news with poorly concealed relief that the nurse who had become entangled with James Thornhill was leaving before that connection brought trouble to their doors. Eleanor felt no regret. Nursing had been her identity for so long, but standing beside James as he rebuilt his organization with ruthless efficiency after purging Crawford's remaining loyalists had shown her a different kind of purpose. She had become the person his men came to when they needed James's ear, the one who saw past the legend to the man and could speak truths others feared to voice. James entered the library now, moving with the easy confidence of someone fully healed. And she turned from the window to watch him approach with that intensity in his gray eyes that still made her pulse quicken. "Do you regret it?" he asked without preamble, standing close enough that she could smell his cologne and see the faint scar at his temple from the bullet that had nearly killed him. "That night, you spoke your fears aloud while I slept. Do you regret the honesty that started all of this?" Eleanor reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. "It was the beginning of everything," she said quietly. "My honesty saved us both because you heard my truth and answered with your own. You could have dismissed me as just another nurse doing her job, but instead you listened and remembered and protected me when you had no reason to, except that my voice mattered to you." He pulled her closer, his hands settling at her waist. "I promise you a life where you will never have to be afraid again. Not of me, not of anyone. I cannot promise safety, because that would be a lie, but I can promise you will never face danger alone." She leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her cheek. "I know the danger will always exist," she whispered. "I am choosing love over safety, choosing you over the quiet life I thought I wanted. And I am not afraid anymore, James. Not of your world or your enemies or the target I carry by standing at your side." He kissed her then, deep and claiming, and Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that she had found her home in the most unexpected place, in the arms of the man she once feared, who had heard her confession in the darkness and decided she was worth fighting for, worth protecting, worth loving with the same fierce intensity he brought to everything he did.